Hi everyone, my name is Mufeaino.
And I'm Taylor Yu, and we are members of the Berkeley Technology Law Journal Symposium team.
Our next panel, Labor Justice and AI, will discuss the implications of artificial intelligence use in the workplace and its intersection with economic justice.
Our panelists include Vinhcent Lei, Bradford Kelley, Alice Wang, and Diana Reddy, and this discussion will be moderated by Colleen Chen. Hope you enjoy.
Welcome, everybody, to today's panel on AI and labor justice. My name is Colleen Chen. I'm a professor at Berkeley Law and co-director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology. I teach and research in the areas of patent law, AI, and the criminal justice system, and I teach a course on the law and governance of AI that I hope to see some of you students in. I'm delighted today to be moderating the discussion on AI and labor justice with a stellar panel of experts who have deep experience in labor and AI. I'm going to introduce them. I'll provide some introductory remarks, and then we'll get the discussion underway. So first, we have Brad Kelley, who's a shareholder at Littler, where he represents employers on anti-discrimination and wage and hour matters, focuses on advising clients about emerging technologies, including AI. And we thought he'd be a great participant on the panel, given that he has worked previously in the government as chief counsel to Commissioner Keith Sonderling at the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. He was a key advisor on the agency's initiative on artificial intelligence and algorithmic fairness. He also previously worked as a senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Labor. I'm delighted to be also welcoming Diana Reddy. Professor Reddy joined UC Berkeley as an assistant professor in 2023. She teaches contracts, you might have seen her already, as well as courses in labor and employment and seminars on organized labor and civil rights law and political economy and social movement advocacy. Professor Reddy's research focuses on the regulation of work as a site where critical choices are made about the relationship between American economic commitments and its democratic ideals. Before she returned to academia, Professor Reddy represented labor unions and workers at the AFL-CIO, Alschuler-Berzon, and the California Teachers Association. Professor Reddy and Brad are joined by Alice Wang, who is also a shareholder at Littler and represents and advises employers on a wide range of labor and employment matters, including wage and hour issues, discrimination, and wrongful termination. She's a key member of the firm's Global Workplace Transformation Initiative, focusing on how emerging technologies, particularly AI, impact the workforce. She helps employers navigate the evolving legal landscape related to using automated decision systems for tasks like recruiting and workforce reduction. And last but not least, we have Vinhcent Lei, who also is an expert in automated decision and systems. He's currently the vice president of AI policy at Tech Equity, which is an organization committed to advancing equitable and transparent AI practices. He advocates for policies that protect consumer rights and reduce algorithmic harm. Previous to that, he was senior legal counsel at the Greenlining Institute, where he led initiatives on AI governance, digital equity, and privacy. Who is also most recently a board member of the California Privacy Protection Agency, where he played a key role in developing rules for automated decision-making systems, which we'll talk a lot about today. So I want to just bring up a few key points to cue up our discussion. And some of these are things that are going to be known to a lot of you as students and members of the audience. Some of you might have experienced this yourself. But as we know, AI right now, first point, is being deployed widely to find, retain, and surveil talent. The 2024 survey by SHRM reports that 1 in 4 organizations already use AI to support their HR activities. And among adopters, nearly 2/3 use it in recruiting, interviewing, and hiring. Among the Fortune 500, the number is much higher. These tools are also being used, though, to find and diversify the workforce. Near 1 in 3 people polled say the diversity of their organization's hires is somewhat or much better due to their use of AI. This private sector adoption is driving a lot of discussion on the policy agenda in terms of the tools that are being used, but also the impact of AI on the workforce. We saw President Trump include in his AI action plan 2 initiatives and recommended executive action building on executive orders around the workforce. One was the Empower American Workers in the Age of AI initiative and Train a Skilled Workforce for AI Infrastructure. And we'll talk a lot about what the impact of AI is on the workforce. At the state level, we've seen even more activity at the legislative stage. Just to take an example, in California, currently pending is SB 7, Senate Bill 7, which would require employers to give workers 30 days notice before they use AI to make decisions related to employment in areas of compensation, hiring, firing, or promotion. And we've had a few bills be proposed on workplace surveillance that would prohibit employers from monitoring or surveilling workers in certain areas and would require notice before these tools are used. Perhaps closer to home, though, is the unemployment reports we've been hearing about as we see young people have a harder time, and especially new grads, get jobs, and what that connection to AI is. The Federal Reserve of St. Louis has published careful research that shows the striking correlation between fields that are theoretically and actually susceptible to AI exposure, particularly in areas of math and computer science, and their actually observed decline in employment. A more recent Stanford study shows that early career workers in most AI-exposed occupations have experienced a relatively greater decline in employment, even after controlling for firm-level impacts. So I want to start by talking about this broad look at the economic landscape as AI is being already impacting jobs and being blamed for some of the challenges that our grads are seeing. So I want to pose some questions that I've collected from students, which are about these concerns about mass employment. Are they overblown? Are they things that we should really be taking seriously? And what are some of the most significant challenges or developments you see on the horizon regarding AI's effect on unemployment, particularly given this conference through a lens of inequality and racial justice? So I'll start with Vinhcent and then open it up to everybody.
Thanks. I mean, there's really like two big questions there, but I'll start with, is mass unemployment, are these concerns overblown? I mean, I think I would say yes and no. I'll acknowledge, we're seeing a lot of headlines about layoffs, especially from tech companies, laying off large portions of their workforce. They'll cite AI. But, a lot of this is localized to tech. And, a big part of this is they're investing in AI infrastructure and, not hiring as many workers, laying off workers. But, you were looking at like the broad industry as a whole, it's like less than 10% is using, Gen AI. And we're seeing that a lot of early studies showing that these investments in AI really aren't showing this return on investment. So I think there's like, a lot of concerns. And then also now we're getting some data back that maybe this is a little bit overblown. But part of that is like we have CEOs of, tech companies on podcasts talking about mass unemployment. The CEO of Anthropic said, 10 to 20% unemployment in the next 5 years. My take is that, this is partially to sell products, right? They want to sell this narrative of AI replacing companies to get C-suites to invest in AI. And, this narrative also helps weaken the power of workers to demand better pay and conditions if, you're at threat of a computer replacing your job. But, the reality is, we look at past technological disruptions, 60% of workers today are in jobs that didn't exist in 1940. Like more than 80% of the job growth since then has been made by new technology. So I think, it's clear that AI will displace some jobs. It is slowing hiring of new grads, but it will create new jobs. I think the question is like, how well will those jobs pay? We've been getting more productive, but employers are taking a bigger share of that productivity and not showing it in the pay. So I think that's the real dynamic that like we should be concerned about.
Great. Diana, some of your research focuses on the regulation of work as a site for democratic ideals. So kind of building on what Vinhcent just talked about, what do you see as the highest priority issues among labor groups with respect to unemployment and AI? Is the concern about mass unemployment overblown? And again, what do you see through a lens of inequality and racial justice? What do you see those adding that on top of the question? Where do you see the focus being?
Thanks, Colleen, and thanks to all of you. I'm just so thrilled to be a part of this conversation and grateful that we're having it. So I think we honestly just don't know a lot about how AI is going to affect employment. As in previous technological waves, there's predictions on both sides. But of course, there's a concern that AI is different, right? Because in the past, automation has been limited, right? It could only be used for very specific uses. It had to be designed for particular physical tasks. AI is capable of responding in real time to changing inputs and addressing a wide variety of roles. And we also know that employers have a history of using technological innovations to reduce labor costs. I think labor groups are incredibly concerned about the impact that AI might have on jobs. I know several. I was listening to a discussion with CWA leaders and some other union officials, and they said, AI is an existential threat to many of our jobs, and particularly, I think, jobs that didn't that the people in them didn't used to have to worry about this, right? Jobs that require independent judgment and discretion, that require applying knowledge to new situations. So there is a lot of fear, but there's still so much. We are very early in the AI revolution, and so I think there's still a lot of room for things to go either way. I think the thing, based on my interest on democracy and work, I think the thing that's important is to emphasize that this question of unemployment isn't just about unemployment as we commonly think about it, right? Like if AI dramatically displaces human workers, it's not just about short-term job loss and having to apply to other positions. It's potentially a permanent displacement of a significant percentage of the workforce to be replaced by artificial intelligence, which I think it's important to be clear that AI itself is the result of, centuries of human labor, both in developing the corpuses used to train it, but then also kind of more immediately the often shadow workers used to make sure that to train and correct the algorithms, as well as the tech workers who help develop the technology. And so if AI is used to kind of replace a significant portion of the workforce, and to allow greater concentration of wealth accruing to corporations and employers and not requiring redistribution to workers, I mean, we're talking about skyrocketing economic inequality, a major change in how people spend their daily lives, how and when we interact with people, and more. So I think it's important to say it's not just unemployment. The risk here is major social and economic change.
Thanks. Let's switch over to now the employer perspective. And I want to ask Brad and Alice to weigh in a little bit about, in your role advising employers, what you've seen regarding how people are deploying AI, what they're doing in terms of retraining or trying to ensure that the workers that they do have can adapt their practices and adapt their skills, as well as new workers, what employers are doing and thinking about when it comes to introducing AI and their sort of incoming workforce.
Not to speak for Brad, but I can say for myself in my practice, I don't really have insight into sort of like this macro issue of, unemployment and job displacement, right? What I can speak to is the various kinds and the most common types of AI use cases that we do see being deployed in the workplace. And by and large, these are AI tools being used in really the HR function, in personnel management. And traditionally, and what we continue to see a lot of is, leveraging AI tools in sort of the talent acquisition process, whether it's sourcing candidates, screening candidates, helping to funnel candidates along sort of like the interview process, gamified testing, AI-driven interviews, all of that. And with all of these use cases, one of the most important aspects that, I think I can, not to speak for Brad, but, that I, often advise clients about and that we're seeing reflected in the kind of emerging patchwork of state and local legislation is that AI should not ever be the end-all, be-all, final say in any sort of these kinds of decision-making processes, right? There should always be some level or extent of humans being in the loop, right? Like we've seen this in for example, the New York City law, Local 144, where we advise clients, really to strive and not to allow an AI tool to be the final decision maker, sort of the decision maker that overrules, human decision making, or to be the most heavily weighted influence in making a decision, right? And for these reasons, I'm not really seeing AI displace sort of human discretion, human judgment, and sort of a human role. But that's kind of my take. Brad might have a different view or more to add there.
Right. But even in what you just said, even if you're not going to have the AI be the primary decider, you'll have a reduced need for headcount in that context, right? So, I mean, to say that AI, a human is in the loop, doesn't mean that it's not going to have an impact on the workforce and sort of hiring.
I mean, it's making it more efficient. It's making these tasks more efficient, right? But I haven't seen jobs being eliminated, like people are not getting rid of talent recruiters because suddenly they have an AI tool that's doing everything that a talent recruiter would be doing or a hiring manager would be doing. We have still these folks in these traditional roles overseeing the decision. An AI tool might be able to screen, maybe you don't need 5, screeners, to screen 500 resumes. Maybe you just need 1 to oversee kind of the decision making, right? But the jobs aren't being, their functions are not being eliminated. There's still going to be a need to some extent for these roles.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the insight, and I invite everybody to kind of chime in because this is a conversation. I will say just anecdotally, relatives of mine in the tech industry have commented just even over the past couple of weeks that they're seeing kind of 2 things. One is just really a slowdown in hiring. So there's kind of natural attrition that's happening at these companies. They're just not hiring new people. And so it may not look like we're getting rid of the role, but as you say, we're drastically reducing the number of headcount we need. And then there's sort of the offshoring in combination with AI, making it, I think, feel like an environment in which people do really need to worry about what is coming. And this is especially in the tech industry. And the question is whether that is really a canary in the coal mine. But we'll get back to that in a minute and invite others to chime in. Brad, do you want to comment as well on this question of unemployment?
Yeah, well, and I think that talking about the whole idea of, the technological change, I mean, as Vinhcent alluded to earlier, I mean, we've always seen technology which impacts the workplace. I mean, with a lot of these, laws that are, a lot of the labor and employment laws that are around since the 1930s or 1940s or 1960s, they've seen the evolution of, the introduction of the internet, the introduction of apps and so forth. And I think that even if you look back historically, there was always a lot of concern saying, what will be the impact? What will be the impact on the workplace? So I think that for our purpose, in terms of advising employers on these issues, is to be kind of focus a lot on what is the existing law. And if you're using AI in a way that screens out resumes on the basis of sex or race, for example, then that would violate Title VII. And if you're using it to screen out those who are disabled, that would violate the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I think a really important question here when talking about equality and fairness with artificial intelligence is that what are the harms? And let's identify those harms and think about the existing law that, that is there that could account for that. And I think that especially in the issue of pay, you have the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the act from 1938 that governs overtime and minimum wage regulations. And I think that even if you're using AI to skim money off or to track time for compensation purposes, if it's in violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is again from 1938-39, then that law applies with equal force. So I do think there's a problem in kind of speculating too much about these harms. I think we need to focus on the real harms and talk about the existing legal framework. And I do think that, to the credit of a lot of these laws, they have survived since the 1930s, the 1960s. So I think that that's a really important thing that we regularly remind employers is to, don't focus so much on the legislation in the pipeline, especially at the state level, which was mentioned earlier, but let's focus on the existing law and the harms we're seeing.
I appreciate that insight. And again, folks should feel to raise their hand or chime in if they'd like to. And it may just be that labor law is not really the right tool for the macro question around unemployment and displacement. We've got tax and we've got sort of workforce development initiatives. Those are not labor law tools, but they're relevant, and we don't necessarily need to talk about them a lot today. But I think the point is well taken that we have strong anti-discrimination frameworks and laws in place that are meant to really address the most kind of glaring examples of discrimination, and we need to focus on how we can enforce those better. Vinhcent, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I think they were conflating two different things: anti-discrimination law, which is like, a harm that AI can discriminate, which is separate from, this question of mass unemployment, which is like more on automation, right? Which jobs have more routine tasks that can be automated. I think prior waves of automation, it really impacted low-wage workers a lot more, right? Which tend to be more people of color. Because automation would allow people to de-skill jobs, devalue those jobs, and then split them out to more people. But with Gen AI, mass unemployment, these fears, well, I think they're a little overblown. I think they are there. It's just going to be slower than people imagine, and there's going to be retrenchment in the industry. There will be a lot of, as that happens, there's going to be a lot of people who lose their jobs, have worse conditions, are displaced. I don't want to, dismiss that. But to the question on like, who's this impacting, right? I think this wave of automation is going to be impacting, white collar workers more, right? And that actually, changes the dynamic of who is impacted by this displacement, right? May not be mass, but there will be, a higher percentage, right? And to that point, right? I think, it's a lot of industries that are more are less people of color, right? Middle management, a lot of software engineering jobs. So I think the impacts of this are going to be more even than we have seen in like waves of automation in the past.
I just wanted to jump in if that's okay, because I think Brad raises a really interesting question about, does technology alter the efficacy of the laws that we have and the interests they protect? And, I think the issue that we've been dealing with kind of, platform mediated work, app based work, is that it's been used to reorganize production such that increasingly platform employers, or they say they're not employers, are able to classify folks as independent contractors as opposed to employees, because they say they are not directly controlling the way in which folks go about doing their jobs. And so, in the kind of policy and academic analysis of this, they say, before you needed a person and to be able to control that person in their daily work in order to produce something. And now because of apps, we can, break work into really discrete pieces and kind of outsource it. And all of the labor and employment laws apply only to statutorily defined employees. And so to the extent technology allows for work that previously was done through employment to be done through independent contracting, it's a fundamental end run around our existing legal infrastructure. And I think that is, it has been a really, it's one of the major issues in labor and employment law now. And it is also one that disproportionately affects workers of color, other marginalized groups, because they tend to be overrepresented in this, workforce that once would have been considered employees, and now because of technology can be deemed independent contractors, whether that's correct or not. There's debate about whether that's misclassification or a true change in production, but either way, it's something that technology has made possible, and it's a real concern for existing laws.
Brad or Alice, but if you'd like to make a comment.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to kind of getting back, and I do appreciate that point about independent contractors, but I do think that part of the recognition is the impact on jobs. And with some of the headcount, that I do think that a lot of employers will look to the independent contractor model. So I think that, it is fair to say, but there has been a bipartisan effort in terms of with the independent contractor model to make sure that there are additional protections that are built in. And I do think, in fairness for, we represent a number of companies that use independent contractors, and that it's not as if they're saying that we're not going to apply anti-discrimination protections and so forth. There's definitely an awareness of, the fact that you do look to existing law. And that's, the EOC will look into that, issues like that. That's the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and other agencies to kind of look under the hood to see, what are the problems there. But I do think that we do need to look at ways to address this, kind of new reality that may end up occurring. And I think that especially when it comes to legislators, because we spend a lot of time, our firm has a workplace policy institute, which is essentially our government relations and advocacy arm. So what that means in practical terms is I work regularly with the U.S. Senate Labor Committee and the U.S. House Labor Committee to talk about AI issues. And I think that one of the biggest problems when it comes to talking about these issues with legislators is, do they understand the technology? And is the technology improving and developing so rapidly that you can't regulate it? So it becomes a moving target. So you see that with the California regulations, where initially the California AI regulations did not account for generative AI. The recent version that came out in June did account for generative AI, but the time before did not. So it's just one example of how, for legislation purposes. But one of the biggest concerns you see, and this cuts across a bipartisan field, is that there's a lot of concerns with stifling innovation. We talked today mainly about AI being used for resume screening, for helping efficiencies in the workplace. But when you look at artificial intelligence and how it's being used in the medical field, my dad, for example, is a neurologist. He's a medical school professor, and he's using AI to treat Alzheimer's and dementia patients. And it's incredibly accurate with seeing, the responsiveness to different drugs for Alzheimer's dementia. And it definitely leads to an increased quality of life. And especially in the surgical context, it's really helping surgeons and perform a whole variety of functions. My brother's a cardiologist, and he's using it for, heart stents and looking at different aspects of how to improve cardiovascular health. So there's a lot of benefits with artificial intelligence, and we focus too much on the harms, then it overlooks the benefits of AI. And I think that's something that's very important. We don't want to stifle that innovation. We want to continue to be leading from the front and making sure that we don't fall behind other countries.
I think that's a great comment to kind of think about the transition from the Biden to Trump administration and the focus more on innovation. I let Vinhcent make a comment. I want to ask one more question, and then we'll shift to that topic. Vinhcent?
Yeah, I just wanted I really hate that talking point about innovation getting stifled, right? I don't think a lot of these regulations are trying to stifle innovation, right? They're trying to put guardrails in. And like this whole race framing, like we need to win this race, makes us, disengage from all of the downsides, like of the harms. So I think we need to consider both, right? Like giving people notice that an AI is being used doesn't stifle innovation. It protects people's rights. So I think conflating, there's potentially regulations that do stifle innovation, right? But the majority of things that people are talking about is just giving people more agency and power over these technologies. And, to just paint such a broad brush, I don't think, any of these regulations are going to stop AI from helping with Alzheimer's or medical care, right? It may give people more control and access and knowledge about these tools. So I don't think that innovation is and safeguards can't go hand in hand.
And more than one thing can be true at the same time. But one thing I wanted to do before we move on from the topic of unemployment and labor is actually address something that might be on the minds of a lot of people in the audience, which is for Brad and Alice. What do you see as the importance for people graduating from law school and entering firms with the greater uptake of LLMs? What do you see as the changes that might be coming in law firm hiring, training, and retention?
Brad and I are actually on our own firm's sort of internal governance committee that kind of vets and oversees sort of the internal deployment of a lot of these tools that have been developed for use in legal practice, right? And from what I've been seeing is firms, just like employers, are not really shying away from these innovations. But again, I think that the practice of law is something that is always going to require that element of human judgment, human discretion. I mean, yes, there are tools that are going to make certain tasks a lot more routine, maybe a lot more commoditized, right? Like doing first drafts of legal briefs or doing shells of things like discovery responses, helping craft outlines of, legal correspondence. But again, like, these are not solutions that stand on their own, right? Like, we still need attorneys with, the legal training, the critical thinking perspective to bring to bear to, refine these processes. I think that clients, are expecting things to be more efficient, just like we're seeing in the workplace where AI tools are being leveraged, but we are not seeing, and I don't think that we will see, a mass displacement in the needs for lawyers. It's just going to be more upskilling, right, of what we're expecting of what junior attorneys are capable of doing. But these tools are not going to displace legal strategy, case strategy, things like that. Like, there's always going to be, I think, the need for that human element.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, one thing that's gotten a lot of attention in the age of AI is the billable hour issue. And, because with the increase of efficiencies, that it's going to, I do think that's something that a lot of firms are kind of struggling with at this point. But I do think one recommendation, as somebody who's at a large law firm, and Alice has mentioned, we're both on the AI internal governance committee, is I think it's really important not to get caught behind on this technology. I think it's really important for associates to, and clerks who are, summer clerks, summer associates, and so forth, to make sure that they're up to speed on this technology, because, we're seeing more and more clients use it in-house, which means that they're reaching out to outside counsel, not as much as, in the past. But I think, as Alice said, is that there's always going to be a demand for that human element. And I think that even with our clients that are looking for artificial intelligence, whether it's for resume sorting purposes or whether it's for generative AI tool use for a whole variety of reasons, they're trying to build in that human element as much as possible. And I do think that for, what Vinhcent had mentioned earlier about the laws, I think that one of the biggest problems with a lot of the AI laws in terms of the guardrails is that they're not clear. There's a real lack of clarity with a lot of these laws. And I think that even the Colorado AI Act is just one example where, the law had so much ambiguity, they've kicked it back to now it doesn't go into effect until June of 2026. It was originally supposed to be February of 2026. And you're seeing that with a lot of these laws, they're being postponed. They're, the New York City AI law is simply not being enforced. And there hasn't been one complaint filed with the New York City agency that oversees that AI law. So I do think that the problem is, from a practical standpoint, is that a lot of employers do feel deterred from using these technologies. Will push back on the idea that they're, kind of, these are just simply guardrails. I do think that a lot of these laws and the statements from agencies and so forth are designed to, kind of put employers in check, so to speak. So they'll call outside counsel for our advice on these, laws. They'll say, how am I able to comply with the California AI regulations, the New York City AI law, and so forth? So I do think there is a degree of deterrence. I do think that there needs to be a reminder about the existing law that applies, but I do think that a lot of these laws are just bad and they're not taking notice and comment. They're not getting comments from the public on, changes that could be made. They're not seriously considering what could really improve these laws. And I think that's what needs to be the focus on any legislation in the future.
And if I might just be able to add one more thing on this topic, going back to, if it's of concern to law students, because Brad and I are on our firm's internal governance committee, at least currently, and I do think that this is going to change going forward. But there is a cadre of clients who are resistant to us using AI to process their information, right? They don't want us, for example, using a discovery drafting tool and uploading, any sort of information related to their business, right? So there are some, and if I were to make a prediction, I think it's going to increasingly be a diminishing cadre of businesses, but there are employers who, frankly, just don't want any sort of AI that we might have deployed in our firm touching your content, right? And so, to that extent, obviously there's going to need to be, humans who are setting eyes on, just the work that we do for them, whether it's litigation, whether it's advice and counsel, whatever it may be.
Thank you. So I do want to return to the colloquy around thinking about the precision of laws that are being promoted, and then also a little bit around the federal landscape changing, right? We're talking at an interesting moment where you see the growth and the uptake of the technology, and you also see this kind of dramatic change in administration, where a number of the AI directives, like the numerous Biden EOs, the EEOC's AI and Algorithmic Fairness Initiative, have been taken down or reversed. So I want to turn over to Vinhcent and ask about kind of the shift in the federal landscape and what that's meant from your perspective, and maybe also thinking about some of the gaps and blockers to enforcing federal labor protections in the first place, and what you think kind of where the need for state law is in terms of filling those gaps.
Yeah, thanks. I work primarily in state policy, but a lot on, federal broadband and AI policy. So, costs a lot of different administrations. What I've seen, at least from the civil society side, is a lot of organizations are just not working on federal issues anymore, right? They're shifting their focus to states. They don't think it's a good use of their time and resources to, be advocating federally. So I think that is tough, right? To Brad's point, like not getting notice and comment, well, there's going to be less, civil society folks advocating on federal issues because it feels a little bit hopeless on that side of like getting, stronger protections and safeguards. I think a lot of organizations are investing in like litigation against, federal actions. So at least, that's the civil society side. But, on more practical, policy side, like what I've been seeing is a lot more focus on, preempting states. There was an AI moratorium that was attempted to be passed under the budget bill, that would have, stopped states from regulating, deep fakes in Tennessee, labor protections in Illinois, labeling and mental health chatbot legislation in California. So, a very broad attempt to preempt, state legislation from the federal level. And I think the other blocker, right, to enforcing the existing laws that, Brad mentioned is that, people don't know how AI is being used. They don't know how it works or if it was wrong. No, they depend on enforcement from the government to do that, right? But, on the labor side, right, NLRB, has like a $14 million smaller budget. They're going to lose 10% of their workforce. 2 EEOC commissioners that were, working on expanding worker rights were dismissed. There's, the new general counsel essentially, works for an organization that thinks the NLRB is unconstitutional, is leading the lawsuit on that, has represented, efforts to stop unions from unionizing, workers from unionizing, so I think on the enforcement side, not just on labor, but in finance and all these other sectors, one of the big blockers is, people depend on enforcement and to keep companies honest, that they're not, discriminating when their use of AI or they're not committing, wage and hour violations. There's going to be less enforcement. So I think that's a big blocker. And then the solution, ideally would be for, states to step up, right? And I think what they need is a lot of technologists. Lawyers aren't the best at crafting, these data requests. I talked to folks at DOJ. They hired a lot of, software engineers, physicists, other people who can do data requests to find out if companies are, creating a disparate impact on their systems, right? State AGs don't have those capacities. They need to hire, they need to step up and, enforce the state laws, I think, in this vacuum on enforcement.
Brad, I want to give you a chance to chime in. I know you've thought a lot about kind of agency authority, especially for post-Lippert Bright, and also because you were able to work under both Trump and the Biden administration, Trump, the first administration, and then continuing, and you've continued to advise on these policies. And what do you see as that interplay between the federal and the state? And can you comment a little bit on where you see continuity and where you do see a real dramatic shift in some of the developments Vinhcent mentioned in terms of what the EEOC and other sort of federal authorities might be doing in this space?
Yeah, so I think for kind of starting off, I do think that there is a lot of continuity from the last administration to this current administration in the sense that the United States approach overall has been very hands-off. You could describe it as a light-handed approach to AI regulations, in contrast to what we're seeing in Europe, where it's much more of a heavy-handed approach, which is really seen with the European Union's AI Act. And the EU AI Act has been, a model for different states. The Colorado AI Act was modeled after the EU AI Act, but overall at the federal level, it's been very light-handed. And even the Biden administration, when we were at the Department of the EOC, and we would put out different AI guidance documents, it was all technical assistance that was unilaterally issued by the chair. It wasn't subject to notice and comment and so forth. Most of that guidance has been pulled. But I do think, getting back to the point that Vinhcent brought up, though, is you're not seeing a ton of AI claims being filed. You're not seeing AI litigation out there. You're not seeing a ton of, focus on artificial intelligence. We sit around here for academic purposes and otherwise, and we talk about these harms. But if there were that many harms out there, I think you would see a lot more activity in this space. There's only one lawsuit out there right now that's being litigated in the Northern District of California involving the use of AI in employment decisions. But at the EOC, they've got this function, it's called a commissioner's charge, which means that, so if you're the victim of discrimination, you could file a charge with the EOC, but there's another way to bring a charge. So you have 5 commissioners at the EOC, currently you have 3, but they can file a commissioner's charge that can look into issues with artificial intelligence and all other types of labor and employment issues. And I think even for purposes of advising on labor issues with the US Senate, they ask us all the time about what's laws that could go into effect that would be very helpful. And I'm convinced that the existing legal system, I think, is sufficient. I do think when we talk to people about the idea of new laws needing to be in place, what would be in place that would really be helpful here? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think that there's obviously transparency concerns with disclosure issues and so forth. But I think with some of the continuity that you're seeing with the light-handed approach, I think that's something that has been largely in place. And I think that's why at the state level, with the moratorium, that would have placed a 10-year ban on any state and local legislation or regulations from going into effect. But I think that in some ways you could say there's a democracy, the whole idea of the laboratory of democracy at the state level, and you could look at California or you could look at Texas and so forth. But I do think overall, I think there's a lot of value in how we're handling AI.
I want to let Diana comment, particularly on the question of the adequacy of the current anti-discrimination frameworks and what some of the shortcomings are. And I think it would be interesting also to hear your take on transparency as a mechanism for dealing with some of the issues that you see in this current sort of set of regulations.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to chime in and say, Brad, I think you're confusing political gridlock with a bipartisan commitment to a light-handed approach. So, I think under President, and I don't see it as continuity between the Biden and Trump administrations. I mean, particularly in the area that I focus on, labor law, I mean, there's just such a stark reversal. I think President Biden's administration wasn't able to accomplish everything that they would have liked, but there was certainly kind of clear use of executive authority, to direct the DOL to think about best practices for AI in the workplace, and the Biden NLRB issuing memorandum saying that certain forms of, kind of bossware and algorithmic management could violate the National Labor Relations Act. And there are charges pending or have been filed and pending before the NLRB as to the use of, bossware to track employees' potential union activity. I think you've written about this. And so you have incredibly titled law review articles, Brad. I just want to point that out. So if folks haven't seen them, you should definitely check them out. Wage Against the Machine is one of them. But anyway, to get back to the topic, I think there is massive political gridlock. I think that's resulting in a lack of federal action, and that means a lot of this regulation is going to the states. I'm very concerned about that because while I appreciate the idea of states as laboratories of democracy, I think, we have a national economy, we have an international economy. But, historically, to the extent that labor and employment laws have been piecemeal across the states, it's meant that often employers have fled to the places within the country that have fewer protections for workers. I was born and raised in Texas. I now live in California. I always say I really care about the workers in both states. And so kind of a state-focused approach to me has really important downsides. The other thing that I want to say, though, about whether there is concern, maybe it's better measured in terms of how unions are approaching this, right? So we have political gridlock, which makes it really difficult to, kind of agree on anything or pass anything or commit to any one particular path forward. But, if you look at union collective bargaining agreements, they are, almost all unions are trying to bargain with employers about the use of artificial intelligence. And this encompasses a huge number of issues, beginning with job displacement, right? So there's a number of unions that have bargained provisions that say, the use of AI will not cannot displace workers or allow for them to be downgraded. I was just looking at this CBA between Boeing and the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. The UC Berkeley Labor Center has an incredible repository of collective bargaining agreements that address technological innovations and what to do about them. And so this agreement has a letter of understanding on AI systems in the workplace. And it includes the company agrees that employees will not be laid off or downgraded as a result of the implementation of AI systems. It also provides for notice, but so when the company adopts any kind of AI management or production techniques, there is notification to the union, but that's not just for the purpose of workers adjusting, or being aware of it, or having kind of, a choice in it. It's for the purpose of bargaining, right? So to the extent employers they're able to make decisions about adopting AI on, if those are considered core managerial decisions that don't have to be bargained over, certainly the impacts on workers have to be bargained over, and workers want that. And, I think actually this is a moment where unions are going to be incredibly important, where they're going to have the ability to focus on the really particularized use and impact of AI and other technologies, given particular workplace, particular material needs, and to allow for workers to be part of deciding how AI should be used in their jobs. I mean, I think I was just looking at studies and it said, the AFL did a study saying 70% of workers are really worried about the extent to which AI might displace them. But also 70% of workers are excited about the idea of being able to delegate some of their work to generative AI systems. So I think, as in so many issues in the workplace, yes, there's the potential for this to be innovative, but who gets to decide and for what purposes and what concerns motivate those decisions? And I think, what's so important here is that workers get to say, this is how I think AI can improve my job. And so it's not just employers kind of, forcing those policies that, again, historically, we know employers use technology to try and reduce labor costs and to increase their kind of management of the workforce in ways that, can negatively impact worker privacy and worker self-determination. So, I think I say look to what the unions are doing if we want to see whether folks are upset about or concerned about what's happening.
It sounds like Alice needs to go, so I'm going to let her kind of chime in a little bit on the state level issues before she does that, and then we can kind of come back to also labor topics, if that makes sense. But Alice, I just wanted to give you a chance. I know you've worked a lot at the state level, looking at the effectiveness of different laws, to just comment a little bit on laws that actually have been able to get over the finish line, or initiatives, and particularly in the California civil rights context, the revision of Title II governing the use of AI-based tools in employment context in California. I was wondering if you would comment a little bit on that. I think Brad referred a little bit to some of your earlier writings and sort of tracking of local law 144 and sort of their efficacy, but I just want to give you a chance to chime in before you need to jump off.
I just think it's worth mentioning that, one of the things that I oftentimes counsel clients on who are, concerned about being compliant, if they've got operations, multi-jurisdiction, and are concerned about complying with, again, this emerging patchwork of state level and local level regulation, is that while there is a lot of activity in terms of what is in the pipeline, there really is not all that much that is actually in effect currently, right? I mean, obviously situational awareness is important in understanding what is in the pipeline, but there is not really all that much in place right now that, I think that folks or our clients really need to be concerned about. But as you mentioned, New York City Local Law 144 is one of them. The Colorado AI Act that's going into effect early next year is another. And then also the California AI regulations that are set to go into effect next month is another one. But even across sort of these different parameters, we see time and again the same sorts of variations on a theme, right? The idea of some kind of notice, some kind of disclosure, some kind of, whether it's called an impact assessment or bias assessment, taking a look at, to what extent, if any, is there any sort of discriminatory or disparate impact in the use of these tools, right? These are all things that I think we saw first really bubble up in the New York City Local Law 144 scenario, but as Brad mentioned, that's really regulation without teeth. There's really been zero enforcement, and I think part of the reason for that is it's crafted in a way that just allows employees to exempt themselves from its coverage very easily. By saying they're not using, an ADS or an AEBT tool in a way that falls within the parameters of that law, right? But for example, in California, the California law, we are seeing these issues and these themes arise again, right? The idea of, needing to do some sort of bias assessment, that would be an affirmative defense to an employer that, may be facing a charge of discrimination based on their use of these tools. So while there is this patchwork of legislation, they are really covering, I think, the same, again, variations on a theme.
Right. And it's not to say that actions taken, in the shadow of litigation or in the shadow of enforcement aren't meaningful and aren't making the situation a lot better in these tools higher quality. But I want to let Vinhcent chime in. Thank you, Alice, for being here. We really appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
We'll continue the conversation here.
Take care.
Yeah, I think I'll just note on this point around definitions and opting out of the regulations. I think that's the problem. Brad talks about a lot of this legislation it's not very clear. And, that's part of the legislative process. Originally clear legislation gets murkier and murkier as, businesses advocate for exceptions to bills, right? Or regulatory language that allows people to weasel out, right? No, yeah, New York City Local Law 144. You can opt out of, you can just say like, a human made the final decision, right? Even if they spent 1 second looking at that decision, and that's what happens in the healthcare context, right? A human makes insurance decisions that determine whether or not someone gets covered for cancer treatment, but technically an AI made the decision and a human spent 1 second clicking approve. So I think that's like a big issue with these laws, and that's why, folks on the employment side are like, well, there's not too many cases. These laws aren't very, aren't effective. Because by design, they're not effective. And to the point of like, there's not a lot of complaints. Well, people don't know if they've been discriminated against by an AI system because they don't know what was the basis of a decision. They just get a denial. And that's kind of to the point, like why we need better transparency for both regulators and consumers so that we can actually bring cases and bring enforcement if there are resources there to actually enforce these laws.
I hear transparency, promoted and enacted and proposed as like a mechanism that's very, very favored in a lot of these bills. And I wanted to ask each of you, as you said, there's transparency to regulators, there's also transparency to consumers. What do you see as the effectiveness of transparency, especially to consumers, right? We see, I think a lot of my students are very engaged in looking at the headlines around, social bots and disclosures that do or don't work. So I'm interested in the extent to which you feel like transparency regulations, what we need to be careful about or where we can lean on them more heavily to achieve the actual aim.
I mean, I can go on that. Yeah, I think, transparency isn't the end all solution, right? We'd want like better worker power, stronger worker voice, better. But I think what transparency does is it makes our existing laws more effective, to Brad's point. Like we have laws on the books against anti-discrimination and all of this. So, businesses have some sort of paper trail that, they can get if they didn't do their due diligence, they didn't do their assessment, and then they can get, dinged for that. And then on the transparency for consumers side, right, it allows us to figure out, okay, assume we had a transparency, we go through an employment decision and we see that maybe it's like a FICRA notice, you get like the top 3 or top 5 pieces of your information that were most relevant to a decision. What if one of it's wrong, right? Like what if they got your middle name wrong? What if they got your college wrong? Whatever, you need to know these things so you can appeal these decisions. So like we don't know what we don't know, and like that really limits the effectiveness of our laws. So I think transparency is just the first step. And then it also helps build political power, right? As people understand to the extent these systems are being used to dictate their life, right? We can get support for stronger legislation.
I think one thing I'll mention, though, when it comes to transparency that I've seen with a lot of the legislation is you have to consider the practical impact. I mean, businesses, as far as, kind of giving that notice, what would be required? Because I do think that we were talking about businesses using artificial intelligence and other organizations, but a lot of employees, or more specifically applicants, are using artificial intelligence to apply for jobs. They're using it for mass applications. So I think that it cuts both ways. I mean, even I do a lot of litigation, and we've seen a big increase in pro se litigants using artificial intelligence tools to draft complaints. And, courts have, addressed that. And that gets into a whole lot of issues about the unauthorized practice of law and so forth. But I do think that that's something that we have to kind of keep in mind here is that, and we get a lot of questions from employers saying, well, if we are using AI tools, are we required to give notice? Should we give notice for transparency purposes? And those are questions that we get, quite a bit across the board, on AI issues. And I do think that we have to consider that, though, as far as like, if you're applying for a job, should it just be there that AI tools are going to be used for part of the hiring decision? I mean, what do we mean by practical notice? I mean, if you're talking to a company and they're saying, I'm the in-house counsel, where does this notice go? Where is it going to be? I think these are questions that we have to consider.
Great. Diana, I don't know if you want to comment also on transparency or other sort of regulatory mechanisms that you think are useful.
I mean, I think I already addressed this in part in the collective bargaining context where, there we see workers saying we want notice, but that's not, just for notice's sake, right? It's notice in order to participate in effective bargaining about how it impacts their work, and how they might do things differently. So ultimately, I think that's got to be the goal. As for, I don't know, consumers, there's all those articles now about people falling in love with their AI bots. And so, I mean, I think we got to be clear if people should know if they're talking to a robot, for any number of social purposes.
Yeah, Vinhcent, I think you want to chime in. And
Yeah.
I also wanted to just, well, go ahead and then I'll ask.
I just want to ground like when people are asking for notice for consumers, right? It's around consequential decisions, right? Like healthcare decisions, employment decisions. And there are techniques out there. So you're using a hiring algorithm to, deny hundreds of jobs. You spent the money to buy that, right? But there are techniques, it's called Line, it's called Shapely, like that can give explanations for why a machine learning algorithm filtered out your resume at the screening stage, right? It's just no one wants to pay for those. No one wants to invest in that. But that technology is there. It's existed for 10 years. IBM sells it. Microsoft sells it. These are tools. They exist. And so when companies say, oh, we can't give explanations, like what's practical? Well, you're using a system to screen out people. You can use that exact same system to also send them an email, to be like, these are the reasons why our system denied it, and these are the pieces of data that we used. So I don't, really agree with like, that it's impossible to do. The techniques are there. It's just not the will of employers, right? Because it'll cost them more money to give people, an explanation.
I think some of my students and people in the audience might be really heartened by that, because I've heard of this program that has been used now by law firms, something called Suited, where you are taking sort of a diagnostic test, and then it seems to be being used now for law firm opportunities for screening without notice. And I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about sort of the pending legislation in California, SB 7, and what might be changing in the future with respect to automated decision making. This is an area you've been working on for a long time, so maybe you can cue up why it's such an important issue and where we've seen progress.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered why it's such a big issue, right? Important decisions made without, transparency. It could be wrong. We've seen big examples of systems getting things wrong in like healthcare determinations, unemployment benefits, things like that, right? And I think in terms of what tech equity is doing, there's two bills. We're in support of SB 7, right? And that is a very worker-focused bill. It prohibits the use of emotion recognition technology in the workplace. It gives workers a little bit more rights to know that these systems are used to appeal a decision if it has incorrect information. So, these are rights that you kind of have in the EU and you have in other places that, we're trying to bring to California. And, that's kind of where I think a lot of workers are coalescing around. Like, first step is let us know and, give us this more agency. So that's SB 7. And then we're a sponsor of AB 1018, which is a broader bill focused on all consumers. Right. And this one also gives notice and appeal to more types of decisions, not just employment ones. And there's also a risk assessment requirement. So, the hope there is companies have to do a risk assessment of disparate impact, right? And if they find it, like ideally they should fix it, right? Otherwise, so I think that's like a big part of what this like internal governance is like companies can get away with not testing these systems. They procure them, they deploy them. They're like, well, the vendor says it works this well. So there's some additional requirements to see like, does it actually work? Is it creating unintended harmful impacts before we buy it and deploy it? So I think those are pretty common sense. People can disagree, but I think that's like the first step to try to address some of these harms.
Great. And I do want to kind of close, we'll close in a minute with, have you think about sort of a hopeful use of AI and AI-related development in labor and economic justice context. So just think about that. But I do want to turn over to Brad for a last comment on what you actually are seeing that we haven't covered in terms of the ways that your clients are dealing with AI as it comes up. I think you mentioned wage and hour and some other contexts that we haven't necessarily covered. I'd like to just give you a chance to talk about them.
I think one of the most interesting types of AI use that we're seeing in the workplace is AI being used for transcription, recording, and summarizing purposes, specifically, Zoom AI. Teams has an AI capability. There was a big lawsuit filed recently against Otter AI, which is an AI recording tool. And it raises a lot of kind of questions about, especially with how to get consent. And, one of the concerns that we see from a lot of clients is, well, how do we get consent? Is it just the vendor who's getting the consent? What if it just appears on the screen? But what happens if you join late or you join from your phone and you don't see the notice on the screen? Or what if if you're visually impaired and you're not able to see the thing? Is there an audio kind of component to that as well? So those are some of the questions we're getting more recently, especially with some of the lawsuits, especially that Otter AI lawsuit that we've been seeing. And I think there's a lot of different privacy points, involved there. And then there's also, a bunch of ethical issues with, recording and transcription. And then there's, of course, also some issues with attorney-client privilege, whatever you're using the recording and transcribing for attorney-client privilege, and if you run the risk of waiving that as part of the process. So that's something we've been seeing a lot of questions on. And I think that's a type of AI harm or potential harm that does need to get more focus.
Great. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for being on this panel. As a closing question, I just would like to go around and ask each of you to identify something that gives you hope in this area with respect to the use of AI and in labor and economic justice context. So Diana, I'll start with you.
It's a great question. I have a few things. I'll go through them quickly. I mean, first of all, I agree that AI can be used to improve people's jobs. I just think people need to have voice in that. Doctors are increasingly using AI for charting, which is something that, took them away from being present with their patients. That was considered, really burdensome. Most of the doctors I talked to are thrilled about the ability of AI to take over these parts of their jobs that they never really enjoyed anyway. I would love if AI could write all the footnotes for my law review articles, right? Like that would really increase my quality of life. So I do think it can make work better depending on who's in control, who gets to make the decisions, what our goals are. And similarly, I think AI could also be used to better champion the needs of working people in the workplace, right? Monitor health, monitor stress in ways that aren't just about increasing productivity or invading privacy, but to understand which kind of workplace practices contribute to stress or to certain types of illnesses, things that employers used to say we can't prove or know. We might be able to study that with more granularity now. But I think finally, what I am potentially excited about is that to the extent this does prompt a really radical shift in the organization of our economy, in line with this idea that AI could be an existential threat to certain industries, certain workers, certain professions. I hope it, prompts a radical shift in thinking about what is an economy for, right? Is an economy just for making more stuff and getting that stuff more cheaply? Because I have enough stuff, and I think a lot of people feel like they have enough stuff, right? Or is an economy about facilitating certain types of social interactions, facilitating a distribution of wealth that makes democracy meaningful, both at work and in the political system? What are we doing here? And I do think the extent to which corporations have long kind of justified their needs based on their benefits for others, right? Corporations are the job creators. And because of that, we need a lot of regulation to benefit corporations because by extension, it benefits workers. To the extent companies stop being job creators, I think it could prompt really kind of radical changes in how we think about regulating them. Because if they are no longer, kind of participating in this, socio-political process of sharing the wealth and building wealth for all of us, then maybe we need to think about them differently. So I'm excited about that.
Great. Brad?
Yeah, I think just a lot of the medical, to kind of piggyback on what Diana was saying about there's a lot of medical advances, and I think it's absolutely incredible. I mean, I spend the day looking at AI for labor and employment purposes, but I think the medical advances are absolutely incredible. And I was also, before I was a lawyer, I was a U.S. Army infantry and intelligence officer. And I think that there's a lot of benefits with the use of AI in the military. I mean, there's a lot of negatives as well, but I think that there are a lot of benefits. And I mean, as somebody who deployed to the Iraq War, I feel like, there's a lot of benefits with AI, so we don't have to go down that path anymore. And I think that's something I'm very grateful for. But I think on a more personal level, I feel like I use AI tools throughout the day, and it really does increase my efficiency. So I know that my 2-year-old is very grateful for being able to spend more time. I feel like I'm more balanced with the use of AI. So I look at my 2-year-old and I hope that AI is beneficial for the world she's going to inherit.
Terrific. And Vinhcent?
Yeah, I spent a lot of this panel, talking bad about AI and all the harms of the tech company. But I actually, I love AI. I use AI, right? And I think the whole point of what the work that we do is to make sure society gets that benefit, right? That dream of where, we don't have to work on mundane, routine tasks, right? I think AI can be a huge gatekeeper, like can open the gates, right, to a lot of I can be an app developer, right? I can do a lot of other things that I couldn't do before, right? I just think we need to figure out the energy cost And to, Professor Reddy's point, we really need to figure out like what does a society where, a lot of this routine labor doesn't have to be done, what does it look like? And I'm excited about that. I'll just end with this. California polling shows that, yeah, majority of people are excited about AI, right? They think about the innovation, but the same, almost exact same majority of people don't think the benefits of AI are going to flow to them the most. They think it's going to go to the ultra elites, right? I think it's going to go to the top 1% of people. So I think, we all share this concern, right? Like AI can unlock a lot, but all of those gains are getting concentrated into these like billion-dollar contracts that, these top AI engineers are getting at these tech companies. So that's what while I'm excited about AI, I'm excited about the opportunity to kind of challenge this norm.
Great. Well, thank you so much. You've all given the audience so much food for thought about the directions that AI and labor can take and the things that they can be doing themselves to work on providing a prosperous future for all. So I want to thank my panelists again. Thank you to the audience, and we'll see you next time for another conversation between BCLT and BTLJ. Thanks so much.